Now that's significant. The Market Research Podcast.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us on this latest episode of Now That's Significant, a market research podcast. This is your host, Michael Howard, the Head of Marketing at InfoTools. Today, we're joined by Kim Short, Senior Vice President, Ipsos North America. Having worked in the industry since 1996, Kim has worked in various capacities, including President of the British Columbia chapter of the Marketing Research and Intelligence Association, and has been with Ipsos since 2003. She has a passion for understanding what makes brands successful and how to drive their success to new heights with the support of communications that entertain, inform, and persuade. Thanks for joining us on the show, Kim.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So, Kim, what's the most significant thing you're going to share with us today?
I would say that it is that data shifts are something that we're always going to face when we are undertaking longitudinal tracking of any kind in market research. And it's never really going to be easy to predict when or how exactly those will happen, because sometimes it's something we're controlling, sometimes it's something that's happening outside of the research process itself. But that doesn't mean we can't stop planning for it, knowing what's going on or the sorts of things that could be happening underlying that when we are undertaking research.
That's a great point. So you've been part of Ipsos now for nearly 20 years. And I guess you would have seen over the years a fair few data shifts of your time. So before we kick into the subject too deeply, could you explain to us what a data shift is and what it means for a longitudinal study?
Yeah, absolutely. A shift occurs when we're seeing or observing a change in results. It might be sudden, or it might be something that's kind of persisting, but over a shorter period of time. And it falls outside what has historically been seen for a given set of measures for a client, whether it's typically it's going to be some sort of a brand measure. And I'd say that we typically see two kinds of data shifts. The first would be internal, or maybe what we would say predictable types of data shifts, and the other would be external. And those are things that we may or may not expect to see, and or aren't expected. So the internal ones are data shifts where there's been a change in the market research process itself, whereas the external ones are things that are outside of our control as an organization. And when we see shifts occurring in a longitudinal study, what it really points to for market researchers is that we need to understand what the source of that shift is, whether it's something we were expecting or not expecting, and start to dig into it to ensure that we can explain it.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so we've got some common understanding now. What kind of events or situations would lead to a data shift? And could you perhaps give us an example of each one?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's break this into the internal versus external again, because they can be quite different. And when we think about the internal shifts, the sorts of places that I've seen this happen, and I think are pretty typical for longitudinal data, is a client perhaps is making a change in the vendor that is undertaking the tracking work that they're doing. And they're usually making that kind of a change because they want access to maybe an approach or thinking or meta learning that they can't get with an existing vendor. Maybe they've had some sort of a challenge with a vendor and they've decided it's time to make a change. And so they move from one company to another with their tracking. And they're still tracking a lot of the same kinds of metrics, but the way that they're thinking about them and using that data changes. But when you migrate, often you're using, say, a different panel blend, or it's an opportunity to say, well, this was working and this wasn't, let's make some changes. And so you start to integrate changes into what you're taking into field, how you're surveying, the panels that you're using, which can have different dynamics and makeups. So all of those kinds of things can lead to shifts. And that, I would say, can be expected. Right. The absolute numbers might change, but the dynamics in the data don't. Right. So the brands that led in the old study still lead in the new one. The ones that were lagging still lag. But you will see changes in the data. And another thing that can happen is that the brands that are tracked might change. So you've got a set of like 8 or 10 brands that you're looking at, and a determination is made that something has either changed in the real world, or maybe the priorities of the organization and what they want to look at changes. And so you change up your brand list, and that context can make a difference in what we see in the data. So again, that's something, you might want to bite the bullet and make that change, but you can expect that there could be some level of disruption in terms of what we see in that longitudinal data. Perhaps a similar kind of thing is the wording of the question needs to be updated, that it's not working as well as it was, or perhaps we put lots of thought into it, but it's just not taking us quite where we want to go, and we don't see that until we actually have results in hand. And so we make a decision to go in and say, all right, well, yes, it may create some disruption in that trend, but it's going to serve us better in terms of understanding what to do in the marketplace if we actually update the question wording. The context of how questions are asked, the order that they're in, that something new gets inserted into a survey. Often, if we're going to add something that's not going to stay in a survey for a long time, we put it at the end of all of the usual questions so that we don't have disruption, or we're managing it. And the other thing that comes to mind for me is a panel blend. And so that's really relevant, what I mentioned right up front, where maybe a client is moving from one vendor to another, but sometimes also there are changes in how panels are being managed, or there's something happening in the real world where the panel blend that was originally put together to support an ongoing tracking program, and you don't want to really have your panel blend change. So maybe you're blending 5 panels. Maybe it's not quite enough, or there's a boost. And so there's a need to actually have more interviews, and that blend can't support everything we want to do. So you have to bring in some new panels, in which case, there have been instances where we've seen changes in that longitudinal data, and we try to mitigate that risk and understand how much stability can we sustain. Can we use the existing panels and get all those interviews? But sometimes you can't. It's just the reality. So that can be another thing that affects that internal or managed side of what can happen with disruption in data or changes. And then external things, of course, the real things that happen out there in the world, like Apple introduces the iPhone, right? And it completely disrupts what's happening in the category. All of a sudden, we're no longer using phones where we're typing with our thumbs, right? We're swiping. Yeah. It just completely changes who's winning in the category and who's losing. So that's an innovation. Swiffer would be another example of that. I was actually working with a cleaning client, and we were measuring floor cleaners, and Swiffer entered the market. We were measuring liquid floor cleaners that you had to water, and Swiffer completely changed the dynamics in the category. And that's real, that happens. If you're not measuring it in your survey, you may see changes that you don't necessarily understand where they're coming from unless you take that broader view and really understand those dynamics. Really good marketing campaigns. And I think of a couple of examples that people will be familiar with. And I know you hear about it all the time, and it was so successful, but the Old Spice campaign was one that really shook things up. And part of it was about making great ads, right? You've got humor, you've got a character who's recurring. There's a whole bunch of things happening there that are really good. They also did sample drops to support what they were doing. So they had a really strong integrated campaign, and it disrupted the category. So it led to real change. Another thing that we're tangling with as an industry, and I think this is not going to go away anytime soon, is issues around fraud. So we get people who want to earn incentives from taking surveys, and so they'll program mobile phones, and actually have factories in some instances where they've got tons of mobile phones, and they're trying to qualify for surveys to earn the incentives. And so that can be something that disrupts what we'll observe, and points to there being a problem in the data that we have to investigate and understand. And then sometimes you just have things that are unusual and you could never predict, like COVID.
Very true. So it might seem a very obvious question, but how do you know if your data set has changed?
That's a great question. It tends to show up in measures that start to change either very suddenly from one period to another, or we start to see that, oftentimes with longitudinal data, you'll see a little bit of up and down, and that's normal. And then all of a sudden it starts to change either, one way or the other over a period of time. So let's say you're doing a quarterly program, maybe it takes 2 or 3 quarters or even a year, but all of a sudden you will see measures either for, the brand that's the client or something else in the category, competitor or otherwise, that just starts to shift. And that tends to point to something happening in the results. I would say when it's an internal factor, that is, we've changed something in the survey, it tends to be a more sudden shift. Whereas if it's an external one, it tends to be a little bit more gradual. So even that nature of change can kind of point to what is happening in either event. We want to be investigating it and thinking about it and making sure we can explain it.
Yeah, okay. Now, this is not quite as obvious, but are there any instances that you're aware of where what's being reported looks unchanged, but what's actually happening in real life has changed? And if so, what indicators would you be looking for in such a scenario?
Yeah, that definitely happens. I'd say it is, in my experience, has been less common, but it can happen. I think I mentioned the Swiffer example a little bit earlier in floor cleaning. And when the tracking program was originally set up, Swiffer wasn't a competitor in the category. That came later. And what we started to see is that the qualifying incidence of people who were using floor cleaners as we had defined them in the survey started to decline. And so the results within the survey looked quite stable, but we had incidents that was going down and down and down. And so that was an indication that there's something happening that we're not capturing properly or fully that relates to the category, because people are still cleaning their floors.
Yeah.
But that hasn't gone away. That hasn't changed. And that behavior is pretty stable. So what it suggested is that we had to think more broadly about how we qualified people who were coming in and doing the assessment for the brands. And it happened that the data was very stable. It could also happen that all of a sudden you lose people who are very open to innovation. And all of a sudden the dynamics for the brands that are left, it's the people who are more passionate about the brands that are still in the study. So you could actually see everything go up. And that would be the more likely indication in that sort of a case. A little different from what you asked, but it's just interesting how it might show up.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point in itself. So you could go, yay, everything's looking really well, but
nope. No, you're missing something.
Yes.
Yeah.
So to mix this up a little bit, an insights team has just spotted a dreaded data shift in their study. What shouldn't they do?
I mean, I guess the short answer would be don't panic. My thought on that one is, just, be cool and think about how you're going to explore what might be causing that and work methodically through a set of steps that will tell you whether it's an internal or an external consideration and what you might do about it, depending on what you find.
Yes. So how then, you touched on it then, but how should an insights team proceed then when they have experienced a shift in their data set? Is it the end of the line? Are there steps they can take to move forward? How should they communicate this back to the organization as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. So internal, I would check and recheck everything, right? Did things get programmed the way we intended? Was there an issue with the logic? Have we seen a change in the panel blend? Did the tables get run correctly? Is there something happening from a weighting perspective? So there's lots of things that from a research perspective, we can take a look at. And there's lots of discrete judgments that are made along the way. And even if it's a program that's been in place for a long time, sometimes you have a new team member on it and perhaps something was missed along the path. And so I personally like to check and triple check all of those pieces when I see something happening in the data. And when you've been working in the business for a long time, you start to get a pretty good instinct for whether something is off or not. And sometimes when you do those checks, you don't quite get to the bottom of it. and I always trust my gut on this because I've had circumstances where I will have team members go back and triple, quadruple check things. And the first couple of checks, they might not find it, but then we do ultimately find that something's gone a little bit off. So I like to do my due diligence on our own processes first. Of course, we go through very rigorous processes in setup, but sometimes things do happen. So that's where I like to begin, is just to absolutely make sure that there's nothing operational or internal that's affecting what we're seeing. And then the second piece is, well, and I guess I'd say for team members too, check with other people, right? Have people seen this before? You know, is there something maybe we're not aware of? Externally, I would say, ideally, we're talking to our clients as we're setting up the program, and we're understanding the category, and we're talking to them regularly as the trackers go on over quarters and years. And we understand what they're doing with their brands. And also we understand what they can tell us about competitive brands. And so armed with that knowledge, we can start to anticipate whether or not we might see something change. And so that can be really, really helpful. Just, you know, knowing your category, go in and do research. So there's lots of times when I personally, or I'll suggest to my team, Google what's happening, right? If there's a brand that's got changes occurring, go take a look at their quarterly reports or their annual reports. What have they been doing? So we work in the telco category, and we saw a huge lift for competitive brand to our client. And we went in and we took a look at what was happening, and the competitor had actually made some lateral acquisitions that leveraged telco technology, but were in, you know, in healthcare, for example. And mobile, and they were kind of doing some really innovative things, and they got a lot of press coverage, and they were running ad campaign about it. And so it was very easy to explain what was happening there. So that can be really, really helpful. Go to YouTube and check out the ads. Are they good? Are they bad? You know, we've got meta learning that we can take a look at the ads and think about, you know, do we think that they're good or not? Maybe they're causing this disruption. We also have social monitoring tools, and we can reach out to our colleagues to do a quick search on that, right? Is there a whole bunch of social buzz happening? Sometimes that's helpful. And I think as far as the communication goes, it really depends on what we found. And, you know, sometimes if we have had an operational challenge, it might be that we're able to go out and refield very quickly, and, you know, just kind of keep everything very stable and correct for something that perhaps was missed. It may be that we need to have a conversation with the client about what's happening in their business, because we realize we need to catch up, or they could have some great hypotheses that they didn't know were relevant when we started down the path, and it kind of fills in the blanks for us. So I think it really depends on what we find.
Yeah, okay. Excuse me. Finally, what role does technology play in helping market research and insights teams overcome the challenges that we've talked about today?
Yeah, I think it's a very big consideration, and I think technology can be very helpful in identifying, you know, it could be people who are not paying attention very much to surveys, right? They're straight lining through questions, for example, in which case we may take them out of an individual survey. If they're showing a pattern of always taking surveys in a way that is very inattentive, the technology can identify that and remove them from the panel. And so at Ipsos, we use technologies like that to make sure that the data quality is very high, and it's all automated, and it's applied to every survey we run. And that's just part of it. Part of it is about panelists being authentic people and real emails, and, you know, there's various layers to that. The other thing that we have started to embed in our surveys is honeypot technology. And basically, if a bot is trying to take a survey, the bot will answer a honeypot question, but a human being won't even see it. So it's just set up in such a way that anybody that has a response to a honeypot question, they just get removed.
That's cool.
Yeah, so the technology can start to automate some of these quality control things. And then I think too, like, the technology is very important, but I would say beyond that, we also want to use smart survey design. We want to mask really well. We want to build in contradictions in questions, so that if somebody hits kind of flags for contradictions, over a certain threshold, we want to remove them from the survey because they're either inattentive and maybe the IPI or like the other technology stuff doesn't pick it up. Or we can take a look at the response and be thoughtful and actually go in and manually remove them if we don't think that what we're seeing is somebody who is a good quality, authentic survey taker. So the technology is important, but we also want to set the surveys up in a way that helps us maintain that high quality.
Oh, very cool. So if I can recap on what we've talked about today, those dreaded data shifts and how insights teams and brands can help navigate after experiencing such a shift. We took time to understand what a data shift is, mentioned a few examples, including those that are internal or predictable and those that are external, out of our control. We looked at both what an organization should and shouldn't do once they've spotted a shift in their data. And we touched on the role of technology and survey design in helping insights teams move forward with their longitudinal studies. I think that covers it, right, Kim? Anything you'd like to add before we wrap?
I think really knowing your category is incredibly helpful and can point to why things are changing the way that they aren't, or put you on notice if something has gone wrong and there's a need to regroup with a client about how we're going to manage that. Just understanding whether or not there is change happening in the category, and just talking to clients early and often about what they're doing, what they know about competitors. If you have access to something like Work, doing broad reading on communications and marketing, on category dynamics, all of that's so helpful. And go and watch some ads. Take a look at what's happening on YouTube across not just your client's brand, but across the competitors that you're looking at. All of that's really cool.
Any favorite ads to look out for, keep an eye on that you've seen lately?
Oh my gosh, I haven't seen anything lately that I've been really excited about, but I would say looking at the case studies for the Cannes competitions is often a really cool way to see what innovative brands are doing. So I love looking at those cases, and the ads are often very, very good, or they've got something cool that they're integrating from a marketing perspective. One of my favorite examples is a grocery chain in Brazil that basically took the itemized grocery list from the receipts. And so this is a Hellman's initiative. What they did is they took the itemized grocery list and they figured out a recipe that people could go home and make using Hellman's. And so what they're doing is they're solving a challenge for the grocery shopper, which is, what am I going to make for dinner tonight? By giving them a recipe on the back of their invoice. They made it so easy. They just used what was in the basket. They had a huge increase in sales within the first month, something like a 40% lift.
Wow,
so just understanding, like sometimes it's not all just about what you're doing, say in digital advertising or television. It's, it's in store if you've got that as a mechanism you can use for your brand. So it's just thinking out of the box.
It's fantastic. Nice. Well, a very big thanks for joining us on the show today.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all the listeners out there too. We'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the podcast, shared this with others, or even left a review. Thank you for listening too. Now That's Significant.